Greetings, curious acolytes of the galaxy, and welcome back to the archives. The ancient Sith were very much unlike their Jedi counterparts when it came to the likes of war, rather purely rely on their own individual strength in the Force, or the cohesion of the perfect army. Sith Lords were more about the avant-garde warfare. This usually included the use of some sort of sorcery or alchemy to create powerful talismans and mutate their followers into absolutely terrible machines of battle. Speaking of mutation, that is actually the topic for today's video. Delving into the flaking scrolls of the first Dark Jedi, we have learned much about how the Sith Lords of old would use Sith alchemy to create horrifying monsters bred for war. These war beasts came from various kinds of species, and it was actually this exact perversion of life that was the reason that Ajunta Pal and his other Dark Jedi followers were kicked out of the Jedi Order in the first place, spawning the Second Great Schism. After the Dark Jedi were banished to the world of Korriban, they would continue their research after meeting with the native Sith pure-blooded people. Learning their ways, they perfected the arts of alchemy to create even more terrifying weaponized creatures. From the Journal of Sorza's Sin, a sorceress and one of Ajunta Pal's followers, we learn about several of the kinds of war beasts that the Sith employed. And it would not stop with just Sorza's Sin either. Siths such as Freed Nad and Exar Kun would go on to use this knowledge to create terrifying beasts of war of their own. So today, my friends, we have decided to compile a list of the top 7 most terrifying Sith creatures of that day. And make no mistake, in most cases, these war beasts were far more terrifying than any individual Sith ever was, and perhaps posed an even greater threat to the likes of the Jedi. So, for those not faint of heart, let us begin our list of the war beasts. At number 7, we have the Hissis. These dark lizards originated as a predatory reptilian species on the planet of Umbria. Inhabiting this planet was a Sith sorceress who decided to bring her experiments to the next level. However, the sorceress was not as powerful as she had believed that she was, and her overconfidence proved to be her undoing. She called on more power than any individual had ever attempted previously, and it proved too complex for her to manage. Because of this, during the ritual, she released an uncontrolled wave of powerful dark energy on the planet. It destroyed every living thing, aside from the semi-sentient Hiss that inhabited the planet, which became totally infused with these dark side energies. Over time, they began to mutate, and coupled with the malevolent Sith spirits that began to influence them, they now turned into giant lizards that grew of upwards of 4 meters, or a little over 13 feet long, with black spikes lining their backs and tails. The Hiss were capable of a camouflage technique that would render them almost totally invisible, both from regular sight as well as sight within the Force, making them the perfect stalking predator. The worst part of the Hiss came as the venom that they would inject upon biting any being. You see, their venom actually affected Force sensitives, and was said to actually be dark-side in nature. Upon being bitten, the victim would succumb to a Force-induced blood frenzy. The only way to cure a wound sustained from one of these creatures was from the Force technique from a Jedi known as Force healing. Many Sith tamed the Hiss and rode them into battle, or used them to creep around when they needed to be more stealthy. And these accidental monsters became the bane of the Jedi for several thousand years. At number 6, we have a being known as the Saleuth. Evolved inorganically from a humble beetle, they were usually no bigger than a womp rat. A result of mutation via Sith alchemy, they were enlarged to the size of a bantha. These giant beetles had 6 legs, and bodies that were covered in a tough chitinous shell. Being adapted to battle, the beetles' claws and mandibles were razor sharp, and their clicking was loud and made for a drumbeat that let the enemy know exactly what awaited for them from their army. Along with their sharp teeth, a defining factor of the Saleuth came from their ability to spray a highly corrosive acid from their mouth. The acid had the ability to melt down thick structures, as well as buildings, so you can imagine how terrifying they were against enemies who were not utilizing any shields or armor. The Saleuth excellently served basically as organic tanks that were good at holding down objectives or creating a dense front line from charging straight into battle. The Sith altered them to take their predatory instincts and ferocity to the next level, with the dark side of the Force fueling their rage. A Saleuth relentlessly attacked anyone and anything that crossed its path, and did not stop until whatever it was that had disturbed it was dead or gone. The creatures clacked their mandibles loudly before attacking, and commonly fought by spraying an acid and crushing their enemies with their jaws. Seleuth were very difficult to control though, and even the Sith creators found it hard to restrain these giant beetles. Just like all other Sith weapons, this creature, along with the others on this list, are borderline overkill for their design purposes. At this point in our list, we're getting into the heavy hitters. At number 5, we have the Battle Hydra, one of the most curious beasts on our list. The Battle Hydra didn't really have a name besides just that, and they were created by the Sith Lord of course, Exar Kun. The Hydra were lizard creatures that had a muscular and almost humanoid body with a long tail and 2 leathery wings. They could switch between being on all fours or bipedal with the hands containing 5 individual digits topped with sharp claws which could be used to tear flesh from bone. Their tails had a stinger that constantly dripped with an acidic crystallized venom that would melt anything that it touched. But the thing that would draw most people's attention would be the 2 heads mounted on its torso atop long fluid necks. Many only had 2 heads, but there were members of the species of Battle Hydra that had far more. The skin was infused with ancient Sith alloys that reduced the damage sustained by the beast. The armor alloy introduced into their basic physiology even reduced the damage from a lightsaber. Interestingly enough, unless being influenced directly by a Sith Lord, the beasts were actually pretty docile if left well enough alone. When in the wild, Luke Skywalker observed on Yavin 4 that they mostly just kept to their own, weren't very aggressive, or just hunted. Luke actually had to keep Jacen Solo from taking one as a pet. But make no mistake, when cornered or being commanded through the Force by a Sith, these beasts were among the deadliest known to nature kind. At number 4, we have the Tukada, known also as a Sith Hound. The Tukada were pack hunters that were tasked with guarding the tombs of Sith kings in the Valley of the Sith Lords on the world of Korriban. These hellish hounds were very large and were thought to actually be Force sensitive themselves. The Tukada were unusually intelligent and were even able to communicate with one another through means unknown, which allowed them to actually become tactically aware. It was claimed that originally the species were non-violent grazing animals, before being corrupted by Sith alchemy and experiments that awakened latent parts of their brain, which transformed them into unnatural abominations. They were so good at what they did that they actually gave several legendary Sith trouble, as well as some notable Jedi. Sorza Sin admits to almost being killed by one personally. She says that she only escaped alive because she had sacrificed a slave in order to feed it. Darth Bane had a few issues with the Tukada while he was on the Korriban Academy. He didn't have too many problems with them at first, but they began to do hit and run attacks as the daytime went on, and he began to wear down. The more tired Bane got, the stronger the next pack attack would be. Even Master Yoda recalls a sad story where he had lost his Kaibook mount while patrolling Korriban. If you think this is one of the strongest beasts, you'd be wrong, as our list is only halfway done. And now, we are truly getting into the most dangerous war beasts in all of the lore. At 3, we have the Terrentatek. Many of you, I'm sure, were prepared for this one, and it's one that is very hard to ignore. The Terrentateks were extremely dangerous, and thought to have been descended from mutated Rancors. They looked much like Rancors, but were about a fourth of the size of one, and sported many spikes, as well as 2 tusks from the corners of their mouths. These tusks were venomous, because of course they were, and the poison often affected one's connection to the Force itself. The Terrentatek fed exclusively on the blood of Force sensitives, and when they were on Korriban, they were a rather big danger to the Sith purebloods before they learned how to control them, and directed their hunger elsewhere. The Sith Lord Exar Kun was also reported to have created Terrentateks through Sith alchemy. A Terrentatek's hide was highly resistant, and in some cases, even immune to the effects of the Force. They became the most dangerous of the creatures bred by the Sith. They were so powerful and dangerous to the Jedi that they were often dubbed Jedi killers, and Exar Kun used these monsters to destroy Jedi outposts on Tatooine, Kashyyyk, and Tython. At some point in history, there was a great purge led by the Jedi to exterminate as many Terrentateks from the galaxy as possible, though some still remained, although very rare. Jedi were often sent into groups of 2 or 3 to battle these beasts, and the Jedi of this group had a strong Force bond between them. This was done so that the group could strengthen itself from the dark influence prevalent in the layers of a Terrentatek, and as the Jedi had to rely on their weaponry and skills alone due to almost being completely Force immune, because of course the Terrentateks were able to fight off the gifts of the Force as they themselves were Force sensitive. This is one of the few species in the galaxy that the Jedi deemed too dangerous to be left alive. Dooku once recalls an account when he and Yoda slew a Terrentatek, even while Dooku was still a Padawan. At number 2, we have the War Worm, Only a very small handful of the war worms existed, as they were regarded as a sort of secret weapon by the Sith in order to give them an advantage that could even win the war against the Jedi in the conflict known as the Old Sith Wars. Freed Nad had created his war worm by mutating an Exogorth, which was the giant space worm that lived in the meteor in Empire Strikes Back. Freed Nad had found an infant Exogorth attached to a ship, and when he found he couldn't tame it, he decided to alchemically alter it to his own means. It created the giant serpent that grew about the size of one of Coruscant's tallest spires. The Dark Jedi who created them, Sorzis Sin, had desired to test her war worm on the Jedi Temple itself and utterly destroy it. The ancient Massassi worshipped this beast as a god until it was killed by Exar Kun nearly 1,000 years later, who did so to impress the spirit of Freed Nad. Unknown to Exar Kun, Nad was engineering this conflict to manipulate Exar, as he could only defeat it by using the power of a Sith amulet, and committing himself more fully to the dark side, as well as Freedom. And finally, at number 1, we have the most terrifying and dangerous of all Sith creatures, a creature known simply as the Leviathan. Created again by Sorzis Sin herself, and used during the 100-Year Darkness. Leviathans were large carnivorous reptiles created to roam the battlefields as living superweapons, and draw the life energies of enemy soldiers into blister traps that were located on their backs. The hide of an adult Leviathan was incredibly tough, and enabled them to even travel through lava unscathed. One of the most repulsive weapons in their arsenal, they developed several blister traps used to store the life energies of their prey. When they killed a being, they absorbed all of the victim's life force, and even their knowledge. Even if a being was freed from the creature's blister traps, the victim was rapidly aged and weakened. Leviathans could also interfere with the sensibilities of Force sensitive, causing the victim to hear screams, develop headaches, and trigger obsessive behavior centered around doing anything to make the pain stop. The knowledge and powers retained by these Leviathans could be accessed by the one who controlled them, and they could acquire the knowledge for themselves. This creature was the personal favorite of Sorzis Sin, who went through several beasts in order to perfect her creation. These beasts were used in the latter days of the 100-Year Darkness in order to back up the Dark Jedi armies. Ultimately though, even these creatures wouldn't be enough, and the Dark Jedi were forced to surrender to the Jedi, who greatly outnumbered them. Despite this though, I think the Leviathans deserve the #1 spot for their grotesque way of being able to absorb entire Force sensitives and retain their powers and knowledge to be accessed by the creature's master. To me, this is a huge threat to any Jedi, or enemy for that matter of the Sith. Well my friends, what do you think of these 7 incredibly dangerous Sith war beasts? Which one was your favorite? And which of these would be the most effective weapon to be used in war, especially against the Jedi? Let us know your thoughts down below, and as always my friends, may the Force be with you, and have a great day.